My father demanded we marry, she cried, her voice cracking against the stillness of the courtyard as warm tears tracked through her makeup, catching the amber twilight. I stood exactly 3 paces back, my hands tucked into the pockets of my tailored light blue suit, my posture an unyielding vertical anchor against her emotional storm. I already signed the wedding papers, I answered calmly, my voice dropping into a low, controlled resonance that instantly cut through the humid evening air. The absolute finality of my words hung between us, freezing the movement of her hands as she stared at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. For the past 5 years, my world had been defined by the cold, sterile data of corporate ledgers and asset retrieval contracts. I was the man wealthy families hired when their empires began to bleed from the inside. A forensic investigator who peeled back layers of shell companies to expose the rot underneath. It was a profession that left me with a profound, unshakable weariness regarding human nature, viewing every relationship as a transactional ledger where someone was always keeping score. Yet, looking at Liliana, a brilliant 34-year-old executive who had spent her entire adulthood defending her family's shipping line from the wolves, I felt the familiar walls of my professional detachment begin to fracture. She wasn't a puzzle to be solved. She was a woman who had been backed into a corner by the very people who were supposed to protect her. The paper in her hands was a restructuring mandate, drafted by her family's tyrannical trustee, Thomas Vaughan, who had weaponized an old debt covenant to force Liliana into a marriage that would consolidate his hostile takeover of the Mendoza shipping line. Vaughan had given her until midnight to sign the marriage certificate to his chosen proxy, believing he had isolated her completely from her own board of directors. What Vaughan didn't know was that I'd spent the last 48 hours dissecting that exact covenant, discovering a hidden counterclause that allowed a legally recognized spouse to assume co-trustee voting rights immediately upon filing. "Theo, you don't understand what he will do to your firm if he finds out," Liliana whispered, her fingers tightening on the edges of the document until the thick bond paper crumpled under her grip. "Let him try," I said softly, stepping forward just enough to block the evening breeze from catching her hair, my eyes locked onto her pale, determined face. The distant chime of the St. Michael's church bells echoed across the harbour, marking the hour and signalling that our time cushion had officially evaporated. The hum of the overhead fluorescent bulbs in my satellite office on Broad Street provided a stark contrast to the historic opulence of the Mendoza courtyard. Stacked cardboard boxes filled with decades of shipping manifests lined the perimeter of the room, their musty smell of old paper grounding the high-stakes gamble we had just initiated. Jackson Hart, my longtime legal consultant and closest confidant, rubbed his temples as he stared at the digital dual-monitor display showing the certified county clerk filing, timestamped at exactly 7:42 p.m. "You didn't just bend the corporate rules, Theo. You threw them directly into the Atlantic," Jackson said, his voice laced with a dry, pragmatic exhaustion as he tapped the desk with a heavy signet ring. "The filing is clean, Jackson," I replied, sitting behind my desk while keeping my eyes on the leather-bound ledger open in front of me. By marrying her before Vaughan's midnight deadline, we blocked the automatic receivership trigger. Liliana sat across from us, having draped my darker charcoal work coat over her shoulders to ward off the chill of the aggressive air conditioning unit vibrating in the window frame. She had spent the last 3 hours meticulously cross-referencing our newly secured voting rights with the upcoming board meeting schedule, her analytical mind overriding her earlier emotional distress. At 34, her authority in the shipping industry was undeniable, a sharp contrast to the small-town Charleston gossip mill that constantly tried to reduce her to a mere heiress looking for a savior. "Thomas Vaughan won't just accept this documentation at face value," Liliana noted, her thumb tracing the rim of her untouched paper coffee cup. "He has spent 3 years positioning his dummy corporations to absorb our deep water roots. He doesn't have a choice on the legality of the spouse clause," I said, leaning forward to point at a specific subsection in the 1994 Partnership Charter. "But he will use the family business threat to force a public role assignment during tomorrow's charity gala." The threat seed was planted firmly on Paige. Vaughn had already scheduled a press announcement for the following evening at the Historical Customs House, intending to introduce his own restructuring plan under the guise of an emergency corporate rescue. Our legal marriage was our only shield, but it also placed a massive target on both of our reputations, if Vaughn could prove the union was a sham before the board voted on Tuesday. To ensure the strategy held, we needed absolute consistency in our public optics and a flawless forensic accounting trail that justified my immediate entry into the firm's financial architecture. "We have exactly 24 hours before the gala to find the specific account ledger where Vaughn hid the simulated debt balances," Liliana stated, her voice hardening with a renewed corporate focus. "Then we don't sleep," I answered, adjusting the brass desk lamp to illuminate the oldest section of the Mendoza shipping charter. The microhook of our reality was simple. We were legally bound, professionally exposed, and running out of hours before the wolves realized the cage door had been locked from the inside. The humidity of the Charleston morning pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Mendoza boardroom, leaving a thin film of condensation that blurred the view of the harbor below. Thomas Vaughn sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his tailored grey suit perfectly pressed, his face a mask of patronizing amusement as he flipped through our marriage certificate. "A brilliant accounting contractor from New York thinks he can marry into a southern shipping legacy and rewrite a debt covenant," Vaughn sneered, his voice dripping with social superiority as he tossed the certified papers onto the table. "The covenant states that any legal spouse of a direct Mendoza descendant gains immediate co-trustee status if the core debt is contested," I stated calmly, my voice dropping into a measured, unyielding rhythm. I stepped directly between Vaughn and Liliana, establishing a firm boundary that forced the older man to look up at me, my hands staying steady as I rested my palms on the edge of the table. "This board will not recognize a midnight marriage engineered to bypass a safety audit," Vaughn countered, leaning forward to signal his 2 security executives standing near the exit. "The county clerk recognized it at 7:42 yesterday evening, Mr. Vaughn," I replied, my tone remaining ice-cold as I slipped a secondary folder across the wood surface. I read through the 12-page corporate amendment in under 90 seconds, catching the exact hidden cross-collateralization trap Vaughn had inserted into the 3rd paragraph. "If you attempt to freeze Liliana's executive access today, you violate Section 4 of the State Trust Act, which carries an automatic civil penalty and an immediate suspension of your trustee fee rights." The room went entirely quiet. The 2 board members sitting near the windows exchanged worried glances as they looked at the legal statute references I had precisely cited. Vaughn's jaw tightened, a subtle muscle twitching beneath his calculated smile as he realized his immediate leverage had just been neutralized in front of his primary allies. "This is a temporary delay, Ortega," Vaughn whispered, his voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of the air conditioning. "The board votes on the full restructuring package at the gala tonight, and your little filing won't save her from the debt call." "We will be there to cast our co-trustee votes," Liliana said firmly, her voice carrying a resonant authority that surprised even Vaughn's loyal security team. The outcome of this initial collision was a clear micro-win for our alliance, but the escalation ladder had just shifted into the public arena. As Vaughn stood up to leave the boardroom, I noticed the subtle tremor in Liliana's fingers where she held her executive pen, a resilience hiding a deep exhaustion. I reached down and picked up the folders, ensuring my sleeve brushed against her arm in a brief, grounding contact that signaled we were completely in this together. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the temperature in my carriage house workspace had soared, making the old pine floorboards creak under the weight of our collective anxiety. Liliana sat at the small kitchen island, her pink dress replaced by a crisp white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled tightly above her forearms, her face pale under the strain of the ticking clock. Our temporary arrangement had clear, rigid terms. We were partners in litigation and finance, maintaining a disciplined professional distance despite the legal reality of the rings we now wore. The inner wound of my past, the betrayal by a former business partner who had falsified ledger entries to steal my first accounting firm, made me hyper-vigilant about maintaining strict boundaries. I found myself constantly checking my internal monologue, ensuring my protective instinct for Liliana stayed rooted in our shared strategy, rather than the magnetic pull of her presence in my quiet home. Theo, the auxiliary accounts from the 2024 harbour expansion don't match the public audit reports, she noted, her eyes tracing a line of numbers on her tablet as she rubbed her left temple with a familiar, rhythmic pressure. Vaughan used an offshore clearinghouse to inflate the equipment costs, I explained, walking over to place a fresh glass of ice water silently beside her tablet, before stepping back to give her space. If I can't prove the equipment valuation was falsified before the committee review at 6 p.m., you can still trigger the emergency debt call, she muttered, her voice laced with the first signs of defeat. I returned to my desk, my jaw tightening as I forced my focus back to the encrypted ledger entries, my hands moving with a rapid, practiced precision across the keyboard. The friction between us wasn't a lack of trust. It was the terrifying reality that one wrong calculation would destroy the legacy her grandfather had spent 50 years building. We don't need the full asset history, I said, pausing to look at her across the dim room. We only need the specific wire transfer confirmation from the Charleston Maritime Bank. Our progress was slow, agonizingly detailed, and entirely unglamorous, as we spent the next 2 hours tracking a single 7-digit routing number through 4 separate shell registries. When the church bells chimed 5, I finally isolated the digital signature of Thomas Vaughan's personal holding company, attached to a secret rebate clause. I have the verification, I announced quietly, observing the visible relief that softened her shoulders as she took a slow, deep breath. We had survived the first major resistance of the afternoon, but the true test lay across the harbour, where the evening gala was already being prepared under the watchful eyes of Charleston's elite. The grand ballroom of the historic Customs House was a sea of black tuxedos, silk gowns, and the low, coordinated murmur of old money discussing corporate real estate. Domestic anchors of our shared crisis were everywhere. The silver champagne flutes, the heavy linen tablecloths, and the constant, suffocating presence of Thomas Vaughan watching us from the VIP balcony. For the past 2 hours, Liliana and I had moved through the crowd like seasoned political allies, our public proximity flawless as we presented a united, unshakable front to the skeptical board members. Every act of service I performed was quiet, calculated, and designed to protect her dignity. I memorized her exact preference for sparkling water with a twist of lime, bringing it to her before she had to ask. And I subtly adjusted my positioning to block a group of gossiping local columnists from cornering her near the terrace doors. "You look remarkably calm for a man who just married into a corporate war," Liliana murmured, her fingers lightly brushing my sleeve as we stepped away from a prominent city councilman. "I am an accountant, Liliana. I only get nervous when the math doesn't work," I whispered back, a tiny, rare smile breaking through my professional mask. Our light humor beat was brief, a necessary release of pressure before Jackson Hart slipped through the double doors near the catering kitchen, his face grim as he caught my eye. He gave me a single downward nod, the signal that our auxiliary investigation into Vaughan's private accounts had reached a critical breakthrough. "Excuse me for a moment," I said to Liliana, my voice dropping its gentle tone and instantly hardening as I turned toward the corridor where Vaughan's primary financial proxy was currently speaking with a bank representative. I intercepted the proxy near the historical archive display, using my forensic credentials and the newly discovered wire transfer data to secure a private, 5-minute meeting in the building's library. Within that quiet, wood-paneled room, I cleanly dismantled the proxy's defensive arguments, showing him the exact timestamps of the fraudulent rebates his firm had processed for Vaughan. "If you don't withdraw your firm's endorsement of the restructuring plan before the vote tonight, your license is gone by Monday morning," I stated, my voice steady, measured, and entirely devoid of heat. The proxy went pale, his fingers trembling as he locked his leather briefcase, and agreed to remain neutral during the upcoming committee presentation. It was a vital, practical win that shifted the legal balance of power, just as the ballroom orchestra began the introductory fanfares for the evening's main address. The heavy mahogany doors of the library slammed shut as Jackson Hart burst into the room, his phone held out toward me with an urgent, flashing notification from the state banking authority. The midpoint twist hit us with the force of a physical blow. Thomas Vaughan had anticipated our legal move and had initiated an immediate, preemptive financial freeze on all core Mendoza operational accounts. He cited an unverified emergency liquidity risk, Jackson explained, his voice rapid and breathless as he pointed at the digital asset freeze mandate, time-stamped at exactly 8:15 p.m. This clause activation removed our entire time cushion. Without active operational capital, the shipping line's cargo ships would be legally barred from leaving the Charleston harbor at midnight. Liliana entered the room a moment later, her face pale but her eyes blazing with an intense, focused fury as she closed the heavy door behind her to shut out the festive noise of the gala. "The main terminal just called," she said, her voice dropping into a shaky whisper that broke the silence of the library. "Vaughan's lawyers are already serving the Port Authority with the freeze notice." The sudden crisis stripped away the last layers of our professional armor, exposing the raw vulnerability of our high-stakes gamble. I stepped closer to her, my hands clenched tightly inside my suit pockets to maintain my self-control, my gaze locking onto hers to provide an unyielding emotional sanctuary amid the chaos. "Look at me, Liliana," I commanded softly, my voice dropping into a low, steadying frequency that seemed to anchor her spinning world. "The operational accounts are frozen, but the primary trust debt hasn't been called yet. If we can't pay the port fees by midnight, the legacy is dead, Theo," she whispered, her hands coming up to press against her temples as she fought to maintain her composure. For the first time since our midnight filing, she reached out, her fingers catching the fabric of my light blue lapel, her touch a desperate plea for stability in the middle of the storm. I didn't step back. I remained perfectly still, allowing her to lean into my space, my presence acting as a physical shield against the corporate vultures waiting right outside the door. "We have one parallel asset registry that Vaughan doesn't control," I said, my voice filled with a quiet, absolute certainty. "My firm's escrow account has enough liquidity to cover the port fees for 48 hours if we sign a mutual indemnity waiver right now." "Oh, that will expose your entire firm to our debt liability," she noted, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and profound gratitude. "I didn't sign those wedding papers just to watch you lose," I answered, my tone heavy with a promise that required no grand speeches or emotional declarations. The humidity outside the customs house had turned into a steady, cold coastal downpour by 10:30 p.m., the rain drumming against the glass windows of the corridor like an accelerating countdown. The social and legal pressure had reached an absolute boiling point. Rumors of the account freeze had leaked to the local financial press, and several prominent board members were openly avoiding us near the main floor. I stood near the entrance of the private committee room, my jaw tight, as I watched a pair of Vaughan's corporate lawyers review our emergency escrow filing with calculated, dismissive expressions. I feared I had underestimated the depth of Vaughan's institutional leverage, realizing that my status as an independent accountant left me isolated against the bank's automated compliance algorithms. "The escrow transfer is under manual review, Mr. Ortega," the lead compliance officer stated, his voice a cold, faceless denial that offered no human recourse. "We cannot release the port fee block without an official trustee sign-off from Thomas Vaughan." "The co-trustee's signature is right there," I countered, my voice dropping into a hard, dangerous register as I pointed to Liliana's signature on the fresh county paperwork. Mr. Vaughan's original charter takes precedence during an active liquidity dispute," the officer replied, closing his laptop with an air of finality that felt like a trap springing shut. I stepped back into the dim corridor, the exhaustion of the last 48 hours finally catching up to my muscles, leaving a sharp ache behind my eyes. Liliana was standing near the window, watching the distant lights of the container cranes at the terminal, a silhouette framed by the dark, rain-streaked glass. I felt a sudden, terrifying pang of failure, realizing that my meticulous planning and legal loopholes might not be enough to shield her from the sheer, faceless power of the banking system. "They won't clear the transfer without Vaughan's approval," I said quietly as I approached her, my voice carrying the heavy weight of our current reality. She didn't look away from the window, but her hand found mine in the dark corridor, her grip tight, functioning as a grounding wire that stopped my own internal panic. "Then we don't use their system," she whispered, her voice revealing a sudden, dangerous clarity that signaled her own shift from defense to absolute offense. At exactly 11 o'clock, the double doors of the grand ballroom swung open, and Liliana walked directly toward the main stage, where Thomas Vaughan was preparing to give his closing address to the investors. The climax of our war was staged entirely within the public eye, wrapping our financial strategy in a moment of absolute exposure that made the entire room drop into a sudden, stunned silence. Vaughan paused mid-sentence as Liliana stepped onto the elevated platform, her pink dress damp from the coastal rain, her hand holding a certified legal portfolio with an unyielding, professional grip. "Ladies and gentlemen of the Mendoza board," Liliana announced, her voice echoing flawlessly through the ballroom sound system as she took command of the microphone. "Thomas Vaughan has initiated an illegal freeze on our operational accounts to force a vote on a fraudulent restructuring package," she stated, her words dropping like calculated precision strikes across the room. She produced a series of certified bank receipts and offshore registry documents that revealed Vaughan's hidden 7-digit rebate scan to the entire assembly of shareholders. "My husband, Theo Ortega, has successfully filed a formal fraud notice with the State Regulatory Commission, which permanently invalidates the original debt covenant under Section 9 of the Maritime Trust Act." The ballroom exploded into a low, chaotic murmur as Jackson Hart began distributing physical copies of our certified audit findings to the board members sitting in the front rows. Vaughan's face transformed from patronizing amusement into a pale, distorted mask of panic as his top legal advisors rushed toward the stage to review the documentation. I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom, my light blue suit a stark contrast to the black tie crowd. my presence providing the final, undeniable proof of our unified legal front. "The math doesn't lie, Mr. Vaughan," I said, loudly enough for the front row to hear, my voice carrying the absolute authority of a top forensic expert who had just closed the trap. "The State Banking Authority has already accepted our filing, and the account freeze was officially lifted 3 minutes ago by emergency injunction." The outcome was a total, irreversible public victory. The board members stood up to distance themselves from Vaughan, leaving the older man isolated on the stage as his proxy allies fled the room. Liliana stood at the microphone, her eyes locking onto mine across the crowded ballroom. Her expression a mix of profound relief and an absolute unshakable certainty. The storm had passed by 1 in the morning, leaving the streets of charming Charleston glistening under the historic gas lamps as the humid air cooled into a gentle, salt-tinged breeze. The aftermath of our public showdown handled cleanly. Thomas Vaughan had been officially removed from the trustee board by an emergency midnight resolution, and his legal team was already drafting a formal surrender agreement. Jackson Hart had taken the final audit files to the federal building, closing out our secondary corporate subplots and leaving our Broad Street workspace entirely quiet for the first time in weeks. Liliana sat at my mahogany desk, the heavy leather-bound ledger closed in front of her, her face reflecting the soft, warm glow of the brass desk lamp as she unpacked her personal calendar from her work bag. Our new terms were being established not through corporate contracts, but through the quiet, deliberate choices of our shared reality. "The Port Authority confirmed that all 3 container ships cleared the harbor at midnight," she said softly, her fingers tracing the edge of the polished wood desk as she looked up at me. "The math worked out exactly the way it was supposed to," I replied, standing near the window while keeping my hands loosely by my sides, the professional distance between us finally beginning to dissolve. I walked over to the desk, my movements deliberate as I opened the drawer to retrieve a small, duplicate set of keys to the carriage house, placing them quietly beside her calendar. "You won't need an escrow shield anymore, Liliana," I noted, my voice dropping its sharp, defensive edge and shifting into a gentle, private resonance meant only for her. "I don't want a shield, Theo," she answered, standing up from the chair to close the remaining distance between us, her eyes reflecting the absolute certainty of her choice. She took the duplicate keys from the desk and slipped them into her pocket, a visible, practical action that confirmed her permanent placement in my world. The micro-joy of our victory was quiet, grounded in the reality of a shared life that we had earned through discipline, competence, and a profound, mutual respect. The golden light of a fresh Charleston Sunday morning filtered through the high windows of the carriage house, warming the old pine floorboards and casting a soft glow over our shared workspace. Our alliance was no longer a temporary legal strategy. It had transformed into a public, permanent partnership that was acknowledged by the entire Mendoza community. Liliana stood near the open porch doors, her hair catching the morning breeze, as she spoke with Grace Duran, our legal archivist, plain confirmation of her relationship status evident in the way she introduced me as her partner to the incoming corporate team. The sensory anchor of our first collision, the thick, crumpled bond paper of the forced marriage contract, was gone, replaced by the clean, certified filing of our shared corporate governance plan resting on the island. Liliana walked back inside, her hands holding 2 fresh cups of black coffee, her smile entirely real as she handed one to me without a single trace of her former tension. Our connection was heavy, grounding and absolute, built on the solid foundation of problems solved together rather than transactional metrics. As I reached out to take the coffee cup from her hand, our fingers brushed in a brief, comforting contact that transferred an unshakable sense of safety between us. I dropped my anchor into the quiet of her presence, leaning forward to press a single, gentle kiss against her forehead. A soft, firm promise that sealed our future without a single word spoken. Looking back at the cold, cynical void I had occupied before that fateful sunset in the courtyard, I realized my entire perception of value had shifted. I had spent my career searching for hidden liabilities in the lives of others, entirely blind to the fact that the greatest asset a man can acquire is a partner who stands beside him when the world begins to burn. Our ledger was finally balanced. Our victory was clean. And for the first time in my 31 years, my home felt exactly like where I belonged. Closing thoughts. Real love isn't about the dramatic chaos of a forced compromise. It is about the consistent safety of someone who builds a shield around your vulnerability and shows up every single day with measurable reality.